So welcome everyone to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Rounds. Dr. Lydia Zalewska, faculty here in adult psychiatry. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, PhD, who is a professor emerita in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary, Canada. She has published widely on the biological basis of developmental disorders and mental health, particularly focusing on the contribution of nutrition to mental health, which is the topic of our presentation today. Her efforts to include nutritional knowledge in the care of people with mental health challenges has earned her a variety of awards. This includes the Rogers Prize, which is a prestigious prize for excellence in complementary and alternative medicine, and also a selection as one of the 150 Canadian difference makers in mental health, and awarded in honor of Canada's 150th birthday. And in 2021, Dr. Kaplan was also chosen as one of the top winners of 7/70 award in Calgary. Really cool award, which celebrates the contributions of older adults to the community. I just thought, having such a award was innovative in itself, and having you being one of the chosen ones was really impressive. And this award was partly for Dr. Kaplan's recent book, The Better Brain, written with Professor Julia Rockledge on the topic of nutrition and mental health, but also for establishing 2 charitable funds supporting research by junior colleagues who study nutrition and mental health. So Dr. Kaplan is truly a pioneer and I would say an influencer in this area of nutrition and mental health. She's passionate to teach people about the connection between diet, the brain, and mental health, and hopes to change how psychiatric care is delivered. So I am very excited to have you here. Thank you for being here, Dr. Kaplan. And I look forward to your presentation, which is titled Food and Mental Health, How Suboptimal Nutrition Drives Psychiatric Symptoms. So welcome, and really excited to hear you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Zalewska. And I guess now, can you see my screen okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and could I just test, do you see my cursor moving around?
Yes.
Okay, great, then we're good to go. So yeah, the 7/70 award is a delightful thing. And so it's more than just being old. And also their slogan is a really good one. I'll just pass this along to you. We don't retire, we rewire. So here I am rewiring to work on knowledge translation. So I'm delighted to speak to an audience such as yours about food and mental health. On my cover slide, the most important thing, and the reason I put it in yellow, is my website. And I'm going to be mentioning that a number of times because virtually everything that I say is on my website, and there are videos and lots of links and lots of resources there. So I have to find out what works for advancing here. There we go. So this is my disclosure slide. I have no commercial interest in any company or the sale of any product, but recently someone said, well, I should probably mention that I do have a commercial interest in the sale of my book, but no, the truth is, don't buy my book, just go look at my website, because my goal isn't to sell books, it's to change, as Dr. Zalewska said, it's to change mental health treatment and policy so that it is truly evidence-based. And until it incorporates the information about nutrition and mental health, it is not. I also have something that I call disclaimers, because if I don't put this up in front, I kind of forget to say it. I just want you to know that I know that there are many causes of mental disorders, not just suboptimal nutrition. We're not talking about all the other things today. We're talking about specifically an area that I think is vastly overlooked and yet vastly supported with scientific evidence. But I do know that there are a lot of things that you folks, especially you clinicians, are dealing with, which are in addition to nutrition. And finally, even though if you look me up on PubMed or whatever, you'll find that I studied during my active career. I was studying mostly micronutrients in pill form. I and also my co-author, Julia Ruckledge, we are food first people. We need to improve the food supply and improve people's food choices because our goal is really not to put the world on pills. The pharmaceutical companies are doing a very good job at that. They don't need our help. So I'd like to start out my talks with a bit of history. And that's because, I don't have time to show you full 3,000 years of history, but believe me, it's there. But the reason I like to show something, just one slide anyway, one study, something about history, is that it's a humbling reminder that I'm not telling you anything new. It's all been known before. Somehow the nutrition world was submerged with psychopharmacology revolution in the 21st century, 20th century, really, starting in the 1970s. But the knowledge was there. Now we have 21st century data to support it. So here's a little bit of historical wisdom. The People's Home Library was the source of practical wisdom, practical knowledge for people who left their families in the East and went out to the West to homestead. And it taught them everything about how to make jam, how to clean your house, how to raise your children, how to take care of health problems, how to take care of your cattle, your sheep, whatever, etc. You can see some other examples. And if you have access to one of these books, take a look in the index, because what you will see is that the number one cause of what they called acquired insanity was imperfect nutrition. Where did that information get lost? It really got lost with the psychopharmacology revolution. It got, as I say, submerged. So here's an overview about what I'm going to be talking about today. First, the problem, a lot of focus on education, what minerals and vitamins do in our brains, the evidence-based, then some practical issues about educating patients, what's insufficient about over-the-counter supplements, and throughout how this information can save money for the people who improve their diets, which will surprise you, and also will save money for our healthcare systems. So here's a little bit of the worst news that I can give you, and that is that it's something that you already know. We have really a lot of mental health problems right now, but I want to show you this in perspective. Many of you will know who E. Fuller Torrey is. He and Judy Miller wrote a book in 2001, which I recommend you take a look at. It's quite amazing how they gathered together international documents, government documents, to try to determine the prevalence of diagnosed, they used the term mental illness, now we say mental disorders, going way back several hundred years. And they entitled their book, they used the word plague. They called it the invisible plague. Why? Because the prevalence rate increased, it tripled from 0.01%, you can't even see it on the y-axis, to 0.03%. And they found that horrifying, and they wanted to alert everyone to this plague that was happening. Now, this was in my lifetime, maybe not all of yours, but I remember when mental illness was rare. And I don't just mean the diagnosis of it, but just the evidence, just amongst people that you knew. And yet now this is what we're dealing with. It's not rare. According to the World Health Organization, the point prevalence is 20%. The lifetime prevalence is 50%, which just seems crazy to me. And I know some of you are thinking, well, more people are coming forward and looking for help, and we want that, of course. And also we have more DSM diagnostic categories that we put people into, and that's true too. But I sincerely doubt if that accounts for a 50% lifetime prevalence. So let's talk about some educational things. I want to cover a few things that I think should be in every educational system from elementary school up through medical school. Your brain is your greediest organ. When I was in school, I was taught you had to eat well for strong bones and muscles. But I should have been taught that I was mostly feeding my brain. And I don't think any school systems are really approaching this yet, but we could try to change this, because your brain accounts for only about 2% of an adult body weight, So you would think it would be about 2% of metabolic demands, but it's not. It's a small organ, as we say here, with massive power requirements. So it represents 20 to 50% of metabolic demands. And some people find this easier to grasp when I give them this bit of information about blood flow. Every adult has between 4 and 6 liters of blood. So you would think that 2% of your blood would be perfusing your brain at any given time, but that is not the case, because approximately a liter perfuses the very complex vasculature of the human brain every minute that our hearts are beating. So that's almost 25%, which gives you an idea of how metabolically active your brain is. And lest we attribute everything to nutrition again, which I don't want to do, keep in mind that it's doing other things. That blood is carrying oxygen, obviously, some immunologic factors, it's carrying away waste products, but it certainly is carrying nutrients to our brain. Now I'm going to say a few words about metabolism in the brain. And before I show you some pictures, I want to just give you a summary in words. The biological rationale behind the importance of micronutrients, by which I mean minerals and vitamins particularly, micronutrients for brain metabolic activity, is very well established. It's just not being taught in the schools. Every neurotransmitter goes through many metabolic steps to ensure its synthesis, uptake, and breakdown. Everybody knows, even lay audiences know, that we need serotonin, we need dopamine, etc. But we can't eat those things. We have to provide our clever little brains with the building blocks so that they build and synthesize and break down and metabolize those important neurotransmitters. A variety of vitamins and minerals are required as cofactors in most, if not all, of those steps. And so when the diet is nutrient poor, or there are individual factors such as inborn errors of metabolism, there will be a decrease in activity. Now, let me show you some of this in picture form. So, simple concept that I try to teach lay audiences about what metabolism is. If you have chemical A and you need to have it converted to chemical B, it's usually in human physiology enzymatic reactions that do that. So you need enzymes, but those enzymes are completely dependent upon having an abundant supply of cofactors present in order to function optimally. I sometimes joke we should get rid of all of our DSM categories and just diagnose people with sluggish pathways half the time, because what they really are lacking are the minerals and vitamins that will maximize enzymatic activity. Now I'm going to show you a couple of pictures to illustrate it. Most of the people in this audience will be familiar with this, I realize this, but I show this down to grade children in 6th grade. I show it to all lay audiences, etc. It's a very, very oversimplified, tiny corner of tryptophan metabolism. And the 3 chemicals that are in red are simply because lay audiences recognize those words. It's the only reason. So you can go online and click on every enzymatic reaction, and each one is represented by an arrow here. And you can ask what cofactors are required for optimal activity in that enzymatic reaction. Here you have 3 minerals. Here you have vitamin B6. Here you have 2 B vitamins and a mineral. Vitamin B6 here, 2 B vitamins and molybdenum, a trace mineral most people don't even know about, zinc, and on it goes. Every enzymatic reaction is dependent on sometimes quite a few vitamins and minerals in order to have optimum activity in that enzymatic reaction. My next slide is just to show you, I don't want people ever to walk away and think this is specific to serotonin. It's not. So my colleague at Oregon Health and Science University, Dr. Jenny Johnstone, said, let's show people dopamine too. So she put hers in a circular form. It's the same concept. You can see the various kinds of vitamins and minerals that are needed as cofactors at every step. And without adequate supply, those pathways are slow. Also, it's not unique to, brain neurotransmitters. This is how a lot of our physiology works. And again, I know you know it. Some of you will recognize the Krebs cycle, the 5 steps of the electron transport chain. And if you take a look at it, you'll find all the vitamins and minerals and amino acids in this case that are essential, absolutely required for optimal production of ATP, our energy molecule. So it's basically what's going on in us all the time if we are eating properly. Now, I'm not going to be talking about omega-3 much today, so I thought I'd just show you this, how all of these nutrients interact and work together. And again, some of you know this. This is basically the transformation of alpha-linolenic acid down to EPA and DHA, which here it is, DHA, which of course is what most people are particularly familiar with. And you can go through the same exercise, look at the enzymes and ask, and here they are in red, what cofactors are needed for those steps to occur, and you'll find the same cast of characters. So just imagine if this were taught in elementary school. People look at these slides and tell me later, you know that serotonin slide, Bonnie? I'm not going to remember anything else you said, which is okay with me. I'm just going to remember that, and it's going to influence what I put in my mouth. So I haven't studied whether or not that's true or not, but they're telling us this all the time, that if children learn that they are eating to feed their brains, and if they understand why, not just what to eat, but why they should be doing it, I think we'll have a larger impact on them. I hope you don't mind my taking a little poke at psychiatrists here, but I worked in a medical faculty my whole career. And I wish I had $1 for every time a psychiatrist said to me, those vitamins and minerals, they don't do much for brain function, do they? Now, these aren't stupid people. I really am not meaning to be rude. It's just an indication of how our educational systems have to improve. When people talk to me about the elimination of stigma, I say, is there a stigma in being told that you need to eat better? No. And of course, reduced suffering would be benefited. And of course, I'll be showing you the financial benefits. So let's go on. I want you to just put this in the back of your mind. It's my absolute favorite quotation. And it's one of the things in my talk that I cannot prove scientifically because nobody can yet. But way back in 1968, Linus Pauling started talking about what is inherited in mental illness. What is that about? And you know, here we are many, many years later, we still don't have a gene for depression, a gene for anxiety. It hasn't worked out that way at all, in spite of the fact that we have spent billions of dollars doing that kind of research. I think less than 5% of mental disorder expression is accounted for by all of that research. So I think we should go back to what he was telling us based on the research I'm going to be showing you in a moment, that probably what's inherited in mental illness, because we know that often these things run in families, are the genes that regulate the brain metabolism of essential nutrients. I hope to see research in that area in my lifetime. So another thing that I want you to take away from those metabolic slides, it's difficult to see why anyone would expect to see an impact from giving people a single nutrient. So when people ask me, well, which vitamin should I take, Bonnie, or which mineral, or when our funding agencies won't fund the whole spectrum of micronutrients that our brains clearly required, but send back the research proposals to my colleagues and say, why don't you study just one nutrient? People aren't, people aren't getting it, okay? We are not talking about scurvy now. Scurvy is a frank deficiency disease. You can prevent it and treat it with one micronutrient, vitamin C, but the brain is much more complex. And the other reason I have this slide here is to remind me to mention to you that, there is no food that has just one vitamin or mineral. Look at this picture. But also, when we talk about the roughly 30 vitamins and minerals that we need every day, we don't even know about the phytonutrients yet, but we know they're in the thousands. So there's a lot still to be studied. Now I'm going to talk to you about our current frightening international experiment. But in order to do that, I want to make sure we're on the same page when we talk about processing of food. Processing of food is on a continuum. You know what a whole food is, like an apple. You probably know what an ultra processed product is. I don't like to call it ultra processed food because it's really not feeding anything. But it has virtually no micronutrients or phytonutrients. In between, there is minimally processed food, and some of it is quite okay. You buy a bag of frozen peas, which has no chemicals added. It was probably flash frozen right after it was harvested, and that's a pretty healthy food, but it's been frozen, so it is considered minimally processed. And this, you know, is ultra processed, and this you will recognize as a typical picture of a Mediterranean style whole foods diet with fruits, vegetables, fish, meat, assuming you're not a vegetarian, whole grains instead of processed grains, olive oil for your olives, or for your oils, a good snack food, fruits and nuts. And this is where we really need to educate our public. Beans and legumes where you save money. So that's my intro to the frightening experiment. What do I mean by that? It has to do with the way our societies are eating. So the NHANES data, some of you are familiar with, it stands for the nutrition, usually flows right off the tip of my tongue, National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It started in 1971, so it's 50 years old now, and it has produced dozens and dozens of reports. It's a US government system, dozens of scientific reports characterizing American food consumption. And a few months ago, at the end of 2021, 2 articles were published, which I think are quite horrifying. What it showed is that in children up to the age of 19, 2/3 of their caloric intake has virtually no micronutrients. Okay, it's ultra processed. That is shocking. Were adults any better? Not a lot, maybe 57%. I just saw an article that came out last week in the Journal of, I'm not going to find the journal name very easily, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, looking at the relationship between ultra processed food consumption and, I said food, product consumption, and the decline in kidney function. And it reported that roughly 40% of the food intake in the northern, this is in the Netherlands, the northern part of the Netherlands, was ultra processed. So it's not a uniquely American problem or Canadian or North American, it's all over the world. We are choosing foods which deprive our brains of the cofactors they need for optimal function. So nutrition is the foundation of physical and mental resilience. This has been known for millennia. What happens to people who are choosing to cut out half of the nutrients, micronutrients, I guess that should say, of what it could or should be consuming? So I'm going to cite a study from your university. Now, I know that Dr. Ansel Keys and the starvation experiments from the 1950s have been controversial, especially with regard to cardiometabolic factors. But to the best of my knowledge, this one that looked at mental symptoms has withstood the test of time. There were 36 normal healthy men who volunteered to go through 6 months of getting 50% of their normal caloric nutrient intake. Now notice that is different from what we have now. Our kids, for example, who have stopped eating whole foods except for maybe 1/3 of their diet, are getting plenty of calories. We know that. So it's not exactly analogous, but they certainly cut back on their nutrient intake. And these are the 1950s terms, but you'll recognize all the symptoms here of depression, anxiety, and even inability to concentrate. So ADD kind of stuff. So we know what happens when we don't get enough micronutrients, and yet we continue to let the food environment dictate the way people eat. I want to go over now the types of evidence proving how important this is for mental health. I'm going to just say a few words about the correlational data, and I'm not going to show you the studies in this talk because I don't have time, but there are about 10 large population nutritional epidemiology studies from around the world. I actually don't know of any in the US, but Canada, Spain, Finland, Belgium, I'm looking at a map in my mind, Japan, Australia. And they've all shown the same thing. So we can stop doing these studies. They all show that even when looking at thousands of people, the people who consume the diet closest to a whole foods, what I might call a Mediterranean style diet, have fewer symptoms of depression and fewer symptoms of anxiety than the people who are consuming mostly a processed food diet. So the consistency of the data gives us confidence that there's a relationship, but people keep doing these studies and I don't know how they get funding for them. There must be a better way to spend that money. They should ask me, but what we really need to do is prove causality. So how do we prove causality? It's with other kinds of data. Prospective longitudinal data are when you start observing people before anybody has any mental disorders and ask whether or not their dietary patterns predict the onset of symptoms. And third is the treatment literature. So I'm going to give you just a sample. There aren't as many studies that are prospective longitudinal because you have to follow the people for years. But the ones that have been published all show the importance of food choices and that the arrow definitely does influence emotional symptoms in this direction. We know that when people are having depression and anxiety, the arrow goes in the other direction too, right? Because when a person's depressed, they're not usually craving carrots and broccoli and stuff. So here's an example of a prospective study that was done in children. And it was done in Nova Scotia in Eastern Canada, published in Pediatrics. Some of you may have seen this. They, in 2011, they evaluated over 3,000 children for dietary patterns. And they also looked at 3 other variables that were not dietary. They involved screen time and physical activity, but I'm only reporting on nutrition here, okay? So the 6 that were dietary, basically it was whether they were following guidelines for avoiding sugary drinks, eating whole foods, things like that. And then because we have a single payer system in Canada, you can go back and get administrative health data. And they asked who was referred to a physician and diagnosed for a mental health condition. And it was predictable. The senior author on this, who's in Alberta, Dr. Paul Voigler's made up this slide for me to show it kind of a cartoon format, meaning there's no metric on the y-axis. But what it shows is that the children who met at least 3 of the dietary recommendations from the Canadian Pediatric Society, right? And the Canada Food Guide. Anywhere from 3 to 6, there was more than a 25% reduction in the need for a referral and diagnosis with a physician. If you add in those other 3 guidelines, by the way, the reduction is even greater. And one of the things I like about this is it echoes one of the adult studies that's from Spain, the SUN study, that showed that people who were doing the poorest in terms of their dietary patterns were the ones who 6 years later exhibited depression, whereas not just the best group, but even the intermediary group had a significant protection and less risk of the development of depression. And the reason I like that is I don't think we gain anything by being purists and saying you have to eat only this way. I mean, I always say life is not living without an occasional chocolate chip cookie. So let's just get people to improve. They don't have to be purists. Now, Voigler's and his group have consistently, in their research, evaluated the financial health economic implications. And so in this case, they did a multiple regression and asked whether or not they actually saved money. And in fact, every additional recommendation that was met by a child was associated with 15% fewer physician visits. So think of the cost savings there. And we can't even put a metric on emotional savings of preventing a child from being referred for diagnosis and treatment. So I've talked about correlational. I've given you a sample of prospective longitudinal data. Let's talk about treatment studies in 2 categories. The whole of diet treatment studies, there are only 3 of them that I know of that have been done well and are in peer-reviewed literature. but they are so consistent across all three. I've put them together on one slide for you. So what this is they took people who these were in adults, people who already had a diagnosis of depression, and on evaluation, they were eating a, just called a poor diet. They were not eating a whole foods kind of diet. And then it was all of these were randomized trials, but you can't use a placebo. So they use comparison groups. So in every one of the three studies, they were randomized to either learn about how to eat a better whole foods diet, or they got peer counseling or social support, something like that. And by the way, this is, I just want to mention to you that I'm going to make my slides available to all of you. And I always give you first author, the journal name, year, so that you can look up any article. I wish everyone did that at rounds. Okay, so this is, I don't have their permission to combine the results, but to me, it's a time saver. They basically found the same thing. And the first point is really important. I've been told so often by physicians, mostly psychiatrists, who say, when I'm dealing with someone who's depressed, diet modification is not possible. They can't address that. And now these people, clearly they had sessions with dietitians and counselors, but it is possible. It's a question of whether or not we think it's important. And logically, dose response, those whose diets improved the most also showed the most improvement in mood. But here's the real knock your socks off finding. 8% of those who received peer counseling, they didn't just get better, but after 12 weeks, this one is specifically from JACA's study, these numbers, in 12 weeks, they actually no longer met criteria for major depressive disorder. So that's something to remember if you're doing therapy. It's something to remember if you're being a friend to someone who is suffering and struggling with depression and mood problems, that what you do and what you say is beneficial or can be beneficial. And then this is the most amazing finding, of course. Roughly a third of those who received the dietary education and counseling went into remission in 12 weeks with no adverse events. And if anyone in this audience knows of any antidepressant that comes anywhere near to that success rate, I'd like to hear about it. So this is, we were chatting before the talk started, not all of you are online yet, but we were talking about how I was going to try to dispel the myth that improving diet is something only for people who have lots of money. So this will surprise you, but in that same study by JACA, these are on Australian dollars, they showed that prior to intervention, this is what people on average were spending per week, and that the weekly cost of food decreased by almost 20%. Now, that is the only scientific data I can show you on that phenomenon, but we need more studies on it for sure. But I can tell you that clinicians here in Calgary, where I live, have been telling me occasionally that they've had people, clients, systematically keep track of what they spend on food prior to and then after trying to improve their diets. Excuse me, they all report saving money. And I've thought a lot about why this is so. Why is the myth out there? And I think, you know, it is true that if you're going to eat lobster and steak every week, it's going to cost you more. But people who are trying to save money on their food and improve their diet, they're turning to lentils, which are so fast to cook, and you can get 7 million recipes on Google in less than 1 second. I checked that recently. And they're turning to the dried beans or canned beans and legumes. All of these are very good ways to save money. But when they go to a vending machine, as some people do, or a convenience store and buy a bag of chips and soda, it looks like it's cheap, because at that moment in time, they're only spending, I don't know what it would cost where you live, $5 or something. And when you go to the grocery store and you're stocking up on a bag of dried beans and rice, etc., you're putting out more than $5 at once. And I think that is supporting this myth that it costs more if you're going to cook with, well, you do have to learn to cook, but anyway, if you're eating a healthier whole foods diet. Now, I need to move on to why might a good whole foods type of diet not be sufficient? Why can't I stop there with the scientific evidence? Well, it comes down to individual differences. And we talk about this a lot in our book. I just briefly have a sentence or two here, that there's good evidence of congenital need for more than the typical amount of cofactors for optimal enzymatic activity. Bruce Ames summarized 50 of them in 2002, but all 50 of those related to physical symptoms, nothing on mental symptoms. But this is basically what the Linus Pauling quotation referred to. We just don't have the evidence totally to prove it yet. And I put this sentence in because I know that people are going to ask me, well, why don't you just test for what people need, you know? And I totally respect, obviously, all laboratory tests of serum levels of vitamins and minerals and so forth that you can do if you suspect various physical illnesses and so forth. But we have to remember that that's peripheral blood. It's not what is carried into the brain. And far more importantly than that, we have no test that I know of, including metabolomics, et cetera. We have no test of what an individual person actually needs for optimal function. And so we have in studies like Julia Ruckledge's, which have looked at serum levels of nutrients as predictors of clinical benefit. The predictors just don't work out yet. We don't have the right tests. And we have a chapter in our book on the soil microbiome, which I don't have time to talk about, but people are welcome to ask me questions later. Now, the way I'm going to be able to summarize hundreds of studies here, but especially the 60 or so that are good, is to give you some summary slides and show you 1 3-minute video. So I'm going to try to push on through this as quickly as I can. First of all, to make it simple, ignore all the single nutrient studies, and that includes the vitamin D studies. I mean, you've seen the brain metabolism slides now, and you can understand there are no single magic bullets for optimal brain function. And sure enough, everybody thought, oh, omega-3s were going to solve everything in the brain. Well, that's a different story because that's not as dynamic a system. But vitamin D was going to absolutely solve depression, and it's not that simple. Is it good for you? Sure, but that doesn't mean it's a solution. So if you ignore the single nutrient data, what we have are the ones that are on a favorite few and the broad spectrum. Most of the favorite few are scientists who are just like clinicians who say, well, I know about the methylation pathways, so I'll try these 3 or these 5, or makes sense to me to try to decrease homocysteine, so I'll put in these specific antioxidants or whatever. But there's very little useful data. The exception is B complex. And so I have the next slide is going to be on B complex. But the real benefits for mental health have been in the broad spectrum, 25 to 30 minerals and vitamins that we should be getting from our food every day. This is the B complex slide. The most important takeaway here is it's not relevant to clinical mental disorders as far as we know. There has never been even an anecdote, to the best of my knowledge, that taking a daily B complex helps with any depression or anxiety. But people have had population samples, like a group of undergraduates at your local college who are going through exam stress, who do report improved resilience with a B complex. And we had it in a comparison group in one of our studies, also not clinical samples, but an underappreciated population-based benefit, I think, for improving mental resilience. Our brains use a lot of B vitamins. So I said I'm going to show you 3 summary slides and a video. This is, and I didn't mention this yet, my co-author and former student, Julia Ruckledge, who's at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand for the last 20 years, is terrific at these summary slides. So all 3 of them are hers. Okay, so this is a summary of all the multi-nutrient placebo-controlled randomized trials in, hold on a second, I have this in the wrong place. I can't read my own text, at improving psychological or psychiatric symptoms. And as you can see, there have been quite a few of them Most of these are the broad spectrum, but not all of them. And the only one where that is surprisingly, you know, a whole lot of them did not show benefit. That's why it says negative. Were in general populations where they didn't have depression to begin with. So why measure their depression? You're going to get ceiling effects or floor effects, etc. So that can explain the majority of the negative trials. But in clinical samples, it's very promising. But this is the most important point on this slide. Common theme is emotion regulation, lowering irritability, managing anger, eliminating meltdowns in children, etc. So this is my next summary slide. Hold on, I feel as if I missed one. Nope, okay. This is a second summary slide that Julia put together. These are the 3 placebo-controlled RCTs, all in ADHD, all with broad spectrum formulas having 25 to 30 micronutrients. And this is the percent improved, and all of them use the CGI, which most of you are familiar with, I'm sure, the Clinical Global Index. And when they broke the blind at the end, you can see the blue bars were the ones who had gotten the real micronutrients, and the others are placebos. The first one is in adults, the other 2 are in children, and you'll recognize these British Journal of Psychiatry, Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So good peer-reviewed studies. And the third one is by Jenny Johnstone, who I mentioned from Oregon, but that's a multi-center trial. I'll come back to that. So I'm going to take 3 minutes and show you a video, and it's okay if you cannot hear it, although I'm going to turn up the volume because the text is on all of it. This child was 9 years old at this time, and he had a lot of problems. And he was in the Maddie trial from Oregon Health and Science University. Micronutrients for ADD youth is Maddie. That's their acronym. Oh, the study is over. It was published in October, so that should be in the past tense.
When they start taking the medicine, it's big change already. Here in the house, but listen to mommy and daddy, and the school is a big difference too. Before it's in a different school, so that school called maybe 6 times per day.
It got to the point where he wasn't going anywhere in school. I was missing a lot of work. The school would come and they would tell me that he wasn't being safe or he couldn't stay in the classroom. There was times that he would have meltdowns and throw chairs and throw pencils, and it was very, very stressful. There is an amazing difference now. He's on a routine. He knows by 8:30 it's time to go to bed. If he's outside playing, he comes in by himself by 8 o'clock, which I could not do before. I would have to chase him outside. So there is a lot of improvement, more independence on his behalf, but I wanted him to be on something natural, which is why I chose this program, because I know he's not taking any drugs. It's not going to affect him in the long run.
This Lego I did by myself, and this is going to the point where the hook is gonna connect right here in that little hole. I'm less frustrated than I used to be, and yeah, I always used to yell and scream about because I didn't get to finish my Legos and I couldn't do that. And yeah, that was the most hardest thing.
So a lot of things have changed as far as us being able to do stuff together, because he's able to handle it more now than before without the distractions and the blurting and the talking in between and the jumping and standing up and just moving around. He's able to control himself a lot better.
Saturday, I'm taking to the movies, watching what? Yeah, I got a picture of sitting in the big chair with the big bucket of popcorn. I never do that before. It's my first time. Can take it to the watch the movies. He have a very, very nice time with me. It's a lot of good things. Yeah.
Okay, I can stop that because they're no longer enrolling. How do I get past this? So being able to control himself, that's what whoops. There we go. That's what I especially wanted you to hear, because that's what this is all about: self-regulation, executive function, etc. I threw this in because it's really a shock. Julia Ruckledge's first ADHD trial showed a tendency for those getting the micronutrients to grow more than those on placebo. But the Maddie trial really monitored it more systematically in all 3 centers. And if you looked at this trajectory, 6 millimeters more in 8 weeks amounts to more than 3.6 centimeters in a year. So you have to wonder if our kids are, by making the bad food choices that we are giving them, whether we are depriving them of a lot of physical benefits too. Anyway, I want to comment on this by making a bold statement, but I believe it's evidence-based. You probably know that it takes 2 placebo-controlled RCTs to get market approval from FDA for a new drug. None of us is looking for FDA approval of a new drug. And there are 3 placebo-controlled RCTs plus case series within subject crossovers, etc., from 3 countries, all getting the same results. Therefore, I think no child should be treated first with medication when presenting with meltdowns, ADHD symptoms, emotion dysregulation. First, feed their brains, teach them life skills, exercise. With Dr. Zalewski here, I'm sure you've thought about mindfulness meditation, improve their home life if possible, but it isn't always possible. Therapy, strength and social supports, all of those things. Medication has a place. It is stupid to be anti-medication. And when it's needed, it should be used. But I think of medication as the supplement. That's why I try not to call the broad spectrum formulas supplements. They should be the primary. Diet should be the primary treatment. Supplements in the form of broad spectrum formulas can be tried later, but medication should be in the last place. And this would be a better mental health care system, in my opinion. Now I'm going to show you one more summary slide, and it's getting a little late, so I'm going to jump into it. There were these terrible earthquakes in Christchurch when Julia was doing some of her earliest work with micronutrients. And then we had a flood here in southern Alberta, and then there were the mass murders in the 2 mosques in New Zealand. These are all terrible disasters. And so we collected data. In none of these situations can you use a placebo. It's immoral, if not unethical, but we had comparison groups. So in all the studies, we had a measure called the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. And I'm going to show you what happened with all of them. You want people to get into the normal level of stress, so below this black bar. And all of these are in 4 to 6 weeks. This is the earthquake randomized trial that Julia did. She did several studies, but this is the RCT. And as you can see, in 4 to 6 weeks, people were in the normal range. This is the flood that we had in southern Alberta, and it paralleled exactly what she found. And then this is not, there was no comparator, but she clinically monitored people following the mosque shootings because they asked her to, as they took broad spectrum micronutrients. This is the comparator for the, let me get it right, for the earthquake. So this is mostly medication. This is treatment as usual. And this is the comparator for the flood study, which was vitamin D, just 1,000 IUs, so an active comparator. So I'm hoping by this point in my talk, you're wondering, why didn't we know about all this? If it's, peer-reviewed, scientific basis, replicated, and then even including multi-center trials that are multi-country, et cetera, why don't we know? Well, the facts are there, but the answers as to why you don't know are complicated. They have a lot to do with the how clinical practice guidelines and the media shape information that we're given. So we discuss the nuances in our book, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. I have a few practical suggestions here. Most of the tips for clinicians are under the resource tab on my website, but I just wanted to mention 2 things here. One is, I find that physicians who I talk to often like to be helped to how to they like help to introduce the topic to their patients so that they don't sound defensive or insulting or intrusive, etc., which is very reasonable. So this is one kind of sentence that I've worked up, that people tell me helps them a lot. There's increasing evidence that how we eat affects how we feel. Let's talk about your diet. And then asking them these questions for which there is no right or wrong and there's no scoring, but it opens the door for conversation. So you might find that useful. And this is my reminder to say, again, I'm not talking about omega-3s, which are very important for our brains and hearts, but don't forget fish, okay, and other sources of omega-3s, essential fatty acids. And the second thing I wanted to give you as a practical tip here, you might not agree with. Some of you really might think I'm wrong about this, but I don't think educating people about specialty restrictive diets is the first logical step. Even though, I mean, we all know people who've gotten much better on gluten-free diets, for example, or a paleo diet. But especially if a person is depressed and you start out with a very challenging restrictive diet, then they're more likely to fail, frankly, and feel worse about themselves. So I really recommend that the way you begin as clinicians is to talk about the importance of real food versus processed food. And usually for that, you do not need a referral to a dietitian. I've been told by clinicians, oh, we can't deal with nutrition in our setting because we don't have money for a dietitian. Well, it doesn't, I have enormous respect. I call dietitians my heroes because their job is one of the hardest in the world, getting people to change the way they eat. But you don't need them to teach people about real versus processed food. This is the kind of thing that you want to do. Teach them to drink water. This is from the Canada Food Guide that says fill half your plate with fruits and vegetables, and the only carbs are whole grain, and of course, quarter of your plate for protein. Learn about beans and legumes, and we have a whole chapter. We have a chapter of tips in our book, and we have a chapter of recipes, but don't buy our book for that. Go online. As I said, 7 million recipes. To just put lentil recipes in the search field, and you'll save yourself a lot of money and diversify your diet. This is a summary of my kind of dream for the future. I think every health setting, every school from elementary school through medical school could educate about nutrition and mental health so that everybody knows what cofactors are. And that's what bugs me about all the books out there that I say they just shake their finger in your face, say, eat this, eat that. And clearly after 30, 40 years, it's not making people change their behavior. But let's educate them as to why. Let's teach them what the nutrients are doing in their brains. And in your clinical settings, given what I showed you with the whole foods diet interventions, think of it as pre-treatment, as the first step for every mental health referral. Maybe offer cooking classes. Ask your clients to track their savings as they change their diet. And support every school food program in your area by educating children, not just how to eat better, but why they need to eat for their brains. I have 2 footnotes and then I'll stop and we'll have questions. One is you need to know that a broad spectrum formula will amplify the effect of psychiatric meds. And this is old news. I've tracked it back to Iris Bell's work in 1992. But the reality is, if your goal is the resolution of a mental health problem, you have to learn how to do a cross titration. If you just want to amplify the effect of psychiatric medication so that you can lower their dose, some people, that's what they want so that they can get rid of the side effects. But if you want to really get rid of a mental health problem and optimize brain function, you need to learn to do cross titration. And the 2 Alberta companies whose formulas are the most studied offer education to clinicians. Remember, I'm not affiliated with any companies, but if I don't put their websites here, you'll all be writing me emails. You can email me on my website, but you know, I get tired of putting those into so many emails. So, and the second footnote is, what about over-the-counter multivitamin mineral formulas? There's nothing wrong with them, but I've never heard even an anecdote that a 1 a day kind of over-the-counter one benefits mental health. And that's probably because they're not broad spectrum and their dose is quite trivial. This is from one of Julia's studies. And you can see over-the-counter supplements for B6, and these were all the ones they could get in a store in Christchurch, were much lower than the amounts in the research formulas. So my final 2 slides are resources. And so if you want, you can ask me for the slides. You'll have these references, or they're on my website, and also videos and Julia's TEDx talk. And thousands of people have been taking her edX.org course also. So I can give you all of that by email if you're interested. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope we're going to open this up for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much for this, thought-provoking presentation. I want to just quickly check for questions. You can put them either in the chat or Q&A. And I see one question from Nikita Natala, one of our psychiatrists, who says, "Thank you for the thoughtful-provoking presentation." Just as I said, or think alike, I work with children with autism who have highly restricted diets, often consisting of ultra-processed foods. I'm wondering if anyone has looked at the broad spectrum supplements in this population. Has anyone examined how effective adding these supplements are when it's very difficult to adjust diet? Bunny, you're muted.
I thought I'd mute it while I coughed. Okay, so I'm back. Thank you, Dr. Natala. It's a great question. There is one case control study published in children and adults with autism, and I can send that out to you, and the really striking improvement in irritability and so forth. And by the way, if anyone is interested in self-harm, the people who were on the micronutrients had a 50% decrease in self-harm, and I talk about that all the time. This study is 10 years old, and I just wish somebody would replicate that. We need more research in this area. Now, in addition, there is a study that's starting. I think I won't name, it's a California university. I won't name the investigator or anything because it hasn't started yet. And sometimes things get planned and don't go forward, but it's at a school for children with ASD. And so they're going to be using a new, I'm pretty sure a new form of the Alberta formulas, which is in a powder that you ground so finely that you can put it under your tongue, and a lot of it's absorbed sublingually. And there are quite a few clinical anecdotes of that helping kids who won't swallow the pills. So we have something to look forward to there. And finally, I would be really neglectful if I didn't mention Jim Adams's work. Maybe Dr. Natala, do you know the Autism Research Center at Arizona State in Phoenix? If you look for references, he publishes as J.B. Adams. And Jim is an amazing fellow who's originally an engineer and through family experiences got interested in autism. And he's been publishing both on a broad spectrum formula as well as more recently on fecal transplant. So you could take a look at his work.
Thank you. I do see another question from Ariel Curie. Again, saying a great talk, thought-provoking, and would like to hear your thoughts on the connection between diet, mental health, and the microbiome. Have you looked into the interactions between either pre-probiotic supplemented diet or probiotic diet, such as focusing on fermented foods?
Okay, thank you for that question. It sounds like a simple question, but it touches on several areas. So I'll just wander around all of it if I may. Excuse me. In our book, we say, look, the research on, we only review in our book, peer-reviewed research and only in mental health. And we have not been impressed yet. There is solid evidence of probiotics improving mental health, but that's because no two studies use the same probiotics and the same distribution, etc. We do have one study, and again, this is from Julia Ruckledge, that looked at microbiome diversity as a result of in children who were in one of those ADHD trials, and showed improved diversity as a result of taking a broad spectrum formula. We know that people who go on whole foods diets, which are basically feeding the good gut bacteria and other microorganisms, that they develop better diversity in the microbiome. Nobody has studied fermented foods to the best of my knowledge. I've got to make a note of that and make sure I'm up to date on it, because you sure hear a lot of interesting anecdotes, don't you? But the connection amongst all of them is very, very close. We really expect that if you're eating a healthier diet, you're improving your gut microbiome for logical, physiological reasons. And you're also decreasing inflammation if you're improving ATP output, because ATP is our natural way of keeping inflammation in check. So they're all very intimately related. Anyway, hope that helps a bit.
Thank you. So next question is from Casey Burrows, thinking about system level change. It seems like to change system like school lunch menus, a cost factor that would be hard to change is the ease with which is to serve ultra processed foods. So it's just easier and cheaper to have processed foods. Do you have suggestions for how we could introduce whole foods on a large scale, like something like school lunches?
So, you know, maybe I'm naive, but I really think that it's all a matter of education. I would rather put my effort right now in education, because as people appreciate that they are going to be improving the behavior and the focus and attention. I mean, I didn't go over any of the cognitive data. We weren't even allowed to put most of it in our book because the book was getting too long. But there's very good data showing that people who are eating better can pay attention better, can focus better. The ADHD trials also showed that, by the way. So if people begin to value that their brains work better, and value that the brains of their children in school are working better, they will demand that more resources go toward better quality food. The same thing about, we have a woman in Ontario who has taken on hospital food, which is notoriously bad, but we're getting out of the mental health area. But she's written a book called Take Back the Tray. That's what we need for school, how we're feeding our school children. But if we're feeding them junky processed food at home, I don't think we have a leg to stand on about what the schools are doing. But education, education, education. I just really get all this feedback from people who say for the first time, they understand why it matters when we teach them about ATP and about cofactors, etc. And this could be taught in schools. You could be teaching children at least down to grade 6 about feeding their brains. I'm sorry if I didn't give you the answer you wanted there about improving school lunches.
Yeah, this reminds me of a study I saw with children drinking blueberry juice and having their cognition assessed, showing improvements in cognition. I think it was within an hour of this condensed blueberry drink, which was really, it's an example of seeing food outside of, maybe typical way of thinking about it, but food as directly affecting the brain. But we have a couple more questions. I want to present them to you. One from Alexandra Zegolov, one of our psychologists. Wonderful presentation, thank you. And you referenced starting clinical work with education around whole food nutrition. This is often not what families are looking for or wanting from us. Can you comment on practices where you have seen this shift work well? How did those clinicians manage the patient surprise, disappointment, or frustration?
Wow, that is a really in-depth question and a really important one, Dr. Zegolov. And the simple answer is no, I can't comment on what I've seen at work. because I haven't made those kinds of inroads yet, except with some individual psychiatrists and psychologists. But don't you think that if you presented it to parents, say, as, you know, we know that we can make maybe as many as a third of the symptoms go away, that we can help your child avoid medication. I mean, you don't have to go into the scare tactics. All this research coming out now showing antipsychotics being a risk factor for your early dementia. Don't go there, but stay positive. But if you presented it as, can we help your child avoid or decrease the need for the quantity of medication or something, don't you think that you could educate them to see that that was a plus? Or am I naive? I'm the one answering, not you. So you don't have to answer that, but I just have to think that there are ways that we can do this.
It's such a difficult conversation, I think, from my experience with patients about diet. You know, any lifestyle habit change is very difficult for patients. So in my experience working with adults with ADHD it's just important to be collaborative and say, where can you start? What's the smallest step that you can start with? And help people feel engaged in that process. And then just helping them stay on track. You know, we can be being the accountability factor of checking in. So not just one conversation, but checking in on that in, you know, non-judgmental way. How is it going? What's difficult? What's possible for you? And you know, allowing that conversation to feel safe for patients.
That's a much better answer than the one I gave, Dr. Zalowski. Thank you. That's true. Working with the parents, maybe showing them pictures, slides of or summaries, or I don't know. I mean, there might be some short videos on my website. There is, if you think that the metabolic pathways would be impactful for some parents to see, I have a 4-minute video on my website where I show and explain just that, just so that people have a concrete image of how important it is to pay attention to this. It might make them feel better about focusing on it. And remember, the bottom line is if you don't buy it, you don't eat it. And that can be a problem in some families. And I've had people say to me, you know, a man recently, my wife has a junk food cupboard and I don't want my kids to have that in the house, and I don't have very good willpower, but my wife insists on having a whole bunch of snack foods on hand and she does the shopping. What do you say? Then you're into a lot of family dynamics, right? That's more your area. Anyway, I'm reading ahead of you, Dr.
Yes.
Zalaska. And this next one is an interesting one, Quentin Gabor.
Mhm.
I don't have recommendations on dose for omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. And this is something that you should ask your physician about yourself or look at your own diet. It will depend on whether you eat fish or not, whether you're talking about a child or an adult, etc. Okay. And delighted to know that Dr. Pauling had an impact on you too. Where did you go to medical school that you were asked to record your nutrient intake? Dr. Gabor? If you would answer that, I'd be curious to know. Because, you know, a lot of the medical schools now are doing community kitchen and teaching kitchens and teaching culinary arts and all. But I don't think they're really yet teaching people what nutrients do in the brain. They're all about diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And it's why some of the titles of I often use as a title for a talk, Nutrition Above the Neck, because we're not paying attention to the brain enough.
I believe Quentin went to University of Wisconsin, if I am correct.
That's what he just wrote in there. Okay, thanks for telling me.
Yeah, and I don't believe I had nutrition course in my medical school.
No.
I don't remember that. So this was more learning after medical school. But it's, I agree that there's a lot more that we can do, as you were pointing out, Dr. Kaplan, in terms of our understanding of this area. Both, you know, its importance and still what needs to be done in terms of collecting evidence. We have one question from anonymous attendee, whether you have insights regarding nutritional optimization for people with long COVID.
You know, there is no information on it, but boy, there is a study screaming out to be done. If anyone wants to do it, talk to me, because one of the things that we hear regularly in our studies, whether people are referred for this symptom or not, they're usually selected for one set of symptoms, and then they come and tell us about all the other great things they're experiencing. And it's the lifting of brain fog. They say, I can think more clearly, often within a day or two. It's amazing. Well, it should be dynamic, right? That's the way it is with vitamins and minerals. But because of that, and a lot of the people with long COVID report on fuzzy thinking and not having energy. That's another, you know, when people ask me, what are the side effects of the broad spectrum formulas? I usually list them as more energy, relief of constipation, and clearer thinking. Those are the side effects that we hear about. And by the way, there's scientific publications up the wazoo showing no serious adverse events. So someone should look at long COVID. And if anyone in the audience is, may I just say, because Dr. Solowski, you mentioned that I've been raising funds. My retirement plan was to do two things: knowledge translation. That's why I'm talking to you. That's why I wrote the book, to try to educate the general public. It's not written for scientists, it's written at the general public level. So knowledge translation is number one. But the second thing is, because the granting agencies, including NIMH, are not yet ready to fund anything involving broad spectrum formulas, they send proposals back and say, pick one nutrient, which just, you know, blows my mind. At any rate, so I decided to set up charitable funds, one in the US and one in Canada. I'm a dual citizen myself, and I have connections on both sides of the border. 501c3 foundation holds the charitable fund, and I've actually exceeded $1 million Canadian. It's not $1 million in US, but it's all distributed. It helped get the Maddie trial started. It provided the funds to do some of the assays, like of the microbiome, and also an epigenomic study out of New Zealand, et cetera. And so, you know, the money is there. We can keep trying to raise money, but there aren't enough scientists. There aren't enough people who they just want to go do a correlational study and get a publication. We need more scientists who want to answer these interesting questions. Sorry, that was a little platform talk. So I don't know who this audience is, but call me if you're interested in studying long COVID.
You never know, Bunny. Somebody in the audience may be really interested in pursuing a research direction with nutrition. And so I appreciate you really supporting this in a very concrete way through grants.
Okay.
I do see a question from Amanda Schlesinger.
Yeah. I can read that.
Yep.
I'm sure we can all read it if you don't mind. This is a really important question, Lydia. Yep. The future of commercially available formulas. You know, there was a certain point in time where I, and then later Julia, went through the same thing. We felt like we were too identified with these two companies in Southern Alberta. We never take a dime from them. We're not affiliated with them. We don't promote their products, but we thought we've got to diversify. So we went out and asked some other companies who produce multi-ingredient formulas if we could study their product for mental health. And we tell the anecdote in the book of what happened to me, because it was so amazing. The head of the scientific division saying, why would we want you to study it? We're making money. So we do need more companies that are willing to develop formulas. In the meantime, all of these formulas that from the Southern Alberta groups are available online. They're available, they're sold all over the world, actually, but they are not cheap because they're better and because they have higher doses than a typical 1-a-day vitamin mineral formula. They are continuing to diversify, but they would welcome having more companies out there producing this kind of thing, and I certainly would too. So right now the future is in the spin-off company that has developed this one, I think, that goes directly into your mouth. And we have a lot of clinical data on that, but nothing peer-reviewed yet. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm aware of is that a lot of the studies use several pills a day.
Oh yeah, because of the minerals.
So I believe it's maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, up to 8 or more pills a day.
8 to 12 in divided doses. And I know that sounds a lot to people, but minerals are bulky. If these were just vitamin formulas, it would be one pill. But think about, I always say, think about the Rocky Mountains where I live. Women, think about your calcium pills. They're always big, and that's only one mineral. These formulas have 15. So that's the reason that there are so many of them. And it's why I got into the pill swallowing field. And I did 4 studies on a new and better way to swallow pills. I don't know if you know about that, Dr. Silowska, but the training video is available on my website, and it's helped a lot of people. So you can take a look at that.
I just wonder if you have experience with using less than that recommended 8 to 12 pills a day and seeing some response, even if it's anecdotal versus research.
Yeah, a lot of people take fewer just for general health, and nobody starts out at that level. So if people get sufficient benefit at 4 per day, and occasionally you hear someone who says, I feel so much better, I'm thinking more clearly, I'm whatever, they stop at 4. So you titrate up gradually. But the only study I can cite is a dose finding study where parents were asked to figure out the ideal dose they thought was helping their children, and the mean came out to be 11.2. So now the new one that is the powder that goes under the tongue is it's kind of like your candy called Pixie Sticks down in the States. And that is actually, I think it's either 1 or 2 per day, and it's delicious, so kids don't mind it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have a few more questions. So maybe for the sake of time, if I'm not sure how important it is for me to read it, as you mentioned.
Sure.
So,
should I just skip over them?
If you can just summarize the question, I think for recording purposes. I don't know if the chat will be available. So I see that Marlon Carroll is asking about some public information for, especially for children and young adults, getting a lot of information from media. If you have suggestions there where this knowledge could be accessed for them.
Are you talking about knowledge about healthier food? We don't have ads for healthy food. We only have ads for ultra processed junk, right?
I'm guessing it's probably
to get the other side.
Or just maybe it's the TED Talks and things on your website that can be helpful. But I'm interpreting it as where can students get information about food relating to brain function.
Well, now I sound like I'm self-promoting, but it's why we wrote the book. We felt there wasn't anything there, and it's why Julia developed her MOOC, her Mass Online Open Course on edX.org, is to try to educate people. So that's all that I can think of right now.
Okay. Let's see, we have a few more minutes before we wrap up. Let's see, from Nathan Ollinger.
Eating concerns you do discuss eating disorders, but not nutrition. Well, how about that slide that I showed you, Dr. Ollinger, about asking about those 4 things, like how many times a day or week are you drinking sweetened drinks? How many times are you eating a vegetable? How many, some people say that you should have, I just saw this in a videotape from the fellow from the UK, Tim Spector, who writes and speaks about whole foods, that in his opinion, I don't think there's a scientific basis for this, but to try to diversify your diet, you should be eating 25 to 30 different plants, fruits, vegetables, grains per week. That doesn't mean that you necessarily eat a lot of each one. If you eat chicken soup that has an onion cut up in it, there's one, right? But the point is that the diversity is very good. You could ask people to keep track of their food intake in terms of real foods. I think it would be a great way to start the conversation and expand it. Exactly.
Do you have an opinion of like green juicing and having lots of, vegetables in a drink? I don't know if that's ever been studied, actually.
No, it hasn't been studied, but I mean, what are you putting into your green drink? You're putting greens with lots of dark leafy greens, give us lots of B vitamins and phytonutrients, and you're putting in fruit, and I mean, you're putting in all whole foods. So what's not to like? It's good for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have one last question. Someone who works with eating disorders.
Do not have the full range of skills necessary to integrate the knowledge. Eating disorders, I don't feel I have any expertise in. I'm mystified by it. I know someone in my own family who has a child who will eat only one food, which is a kind of eating disorder that is mind-boggling. I'm sorry, I don't feel I have any special knowledge for you on eating disorders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does anybody else?
Well, I think we know that there are likely nutritional deficiencies that may develop, or just effects on physiology and likely brain. That's just my sort of non-ADHD experts opinion. So it'll be very interesting to see if supplements in that population would be helpful too.
Yeah, no one has done that, but Dr. Zalaska, on a one-on-one, I happen to know a student who has pretty severe anorexia and is very knowledgeable. And so I tried to get her to take one of the micronutrient formulas and could not get her to swallow them any more than if I had offered her a steak. So I think there are huge psychological issues there that are beyond me.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to just say, which I think is very basic, but maybe worth mentioning, is that when you talk about whole foods, you're not differentiating organic or non-organic foods necessarily.
No, it's a really interesting question. I think that organic farmers are better stewards of the soil, and our soil is a huge problem. 97%, it's estimated, of our arable land in North America is saturated by glyphosate, which is the herbicide in Roundup, and which is a chemical chelator and prevents us from getting minerals that we need. And if the plants can't get the minerals they need, they can't synthesize the vitamins. I mean, that's how the cycle goes. A lot of people don't realize that we want healthy soil, heavily mineralized, with healthy organisms, a good microbiome. Then the plants uptake the minerals, they can synthesize the vitamins. They do a lot of other things too, but we come along, we eat the healthy plants, and we get minerals and vitamins, which we cannot manufacture. And so, except for small amounts of B vitamins in our guts, and even then we don't do that. It's our microorganisms that produce that. We humans are really pretty stupid in that regard, very limited in that regard. At any rate, this is just a very big problem. And there are a lot of organic farmers who are trying to restore the soil. Regenerative farming is all the rage, but it's still such a tiny proportion. But go to your farmers markets, talk to the farmers, find out what they're doing in the way of either remineralizing or protecting the soil. Let them know that you care. and then buy from them. That's a good thing to do if you have the money and the time to do that sort of thing.
Well, I think that might be a good place to stop. Thank you so much for bringing your really lifelong expertise to this talk and raising, I think, our awareness and also more questions about this. We do have a chance to meet with Dr. Kaplan tomorrow. There's a sign up for some individual meetings. I think we can still add people to that if anyone's interested or has questions after today's talk. And again, thank you so much, everyone, and Dr. Kaplan.
Thank you all. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.